I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. The 18th Congressional District of Texas has a legacy of transformative leadership, from Representative Barbara Jordan to Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. But for nearly a year, that seat has sat vacant, leaving nearly 800,000 Houstonians without a voice in Congress during a time of crisis. It's hurricane season. They have disaster recovery needs. And of course, there have been the devastating outcomes related to the state's abortion ban. In this episode, I speak with Amanda Edwards, a native of the district and former Houston City Council member who's running to carry that legacy forward. In our conversation, Amanda shares her deep personal ties to the community, the urgency of restoring its representation, and her vision for leadership that shows up, not just during campaign season, but when people need it most. We also talk about the climate crisis, reproductive justice in Texas, and what it truly means to serve. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Amanda Edwards. Amanda Edwards, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this platform.
So you're running to represent the 18th Congressional District in Texas, and this is a legacy seat. The seat was most recently held by Sheila Jackson Lee, and she sadly passed away in July of last year. And I think from 1973 to 1979, Barbara Jordan held the seat too.
Yeah, so you have Barbara Jordan actually was the first to hold the seat when they moved it to Houston. And so the 18th Congressional District was elsewhere in Texas, got moved to Houston. She was the first to hold it. And as you stated, served in just as a trailblazer for generations of leaders to want to emulate her oratory skills and her ability to govern. A lot of what she did was just exceptional. And of course, you had her and her leadership, and then it was followed by Congressman Mickey Leland, who died tragically in a plane crash, and then Congresswoman Jackson Lee, of course, who held the seat for nearly 30 years. And I had the opportunity to have my start after college in the 18th Congressional District office working for Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And so, of course, we lost her last year in the summertime. And of course, the community is still processing that. And then, of course, you have Congressman Sylvester Turner, who was the successor to Congresswoman Jackson Lee, who then passed just this March. So there's been a lot of tragedy in concert with this seat, but certainly there's a strong legacy of strong leaders who really put people first. And I think that's what our campaign is about.
And I did see in your bio that you worked for Representative Sheila Jackson Lee for a while in DC, and you've been everywhere. You were in New Orleans for a while, I think, in Atlanta. So, but you're back home to Texas now, where you were born, I think, right?
Born and raised in the 18th Congressional District, for that matter. Somebody asked me where I was born, like hospital. Even the hospital I was born in was actually the 18th. So down from the address to my home to the hospital.
Yeah, I always like to ask people, especially when they're running to represent their state and their district, what do you love about Texas?
I have to say, and I'll speak to the 18th in particular because, of course, I'm seeking to serve the district. My roots in the 18th Congressional District run deep. I was born and raised, and I still live in that district, but it extends actually back generations. My uncles, my great uncles, used to own the old CNL shoe repair on Lyons Avenue in the heart of Fifth Ward. And so they mentored hundreds of young boys and youth and tried to help them keep their grades up and receive mentorship during that time. And so gave back to that community in that way. My mom used to work at the charity hospital right down the street from them and did so until it closed on Lyons Avenue. And we just have deep roots. My parents met at Texas Southern University, where, of course, that's part of the district, deep part of the district. But then I've gone to high school there, I go to church there, and it's just got such amazing history and amazing culture and wonderful people. That's why I think people are so attached to this seat and the concept of it and this district, because there's so much rich history and culture and grit and perseverance that you can just feel when you're in that district. And it's a very unique place to be. And I'm very glad that is for generations been a part of my family's lineage.
Right. And the seat's been open, I think, since last summer. Well, technically, Greg Abbott, the governor there, held the seat open and didn't hold special elections.
Yes, well, there's been a lot of tragedy, as you highlighted, when Congresswoman Jackson Lee passed away. The vacancy was created in 2024. It was filled for a short period of time, but then, of course, as we had another vacancy that occurred. And so, with Governor Abbott not filling the seat, it's a disservice to the 800,000 people who live there. Not only do 800,000 people not have a voice, not only do the 800,000 people not have a vote, not only do the 800,000 people not have an ability to be advocated for when it comes to federal funding, but then they're also without having that clear vision for where that community can thrive. And so having an absence of leadership, we've seen the implications of that in just the last 2 weeks without having had the election already. And now that big beautiful bill, as President Trump has called it, which is obviously the budget priorities that cut Medicaid by $900 billion and SNAP by $300 billion, has a disproportionate effect on a district like District 18 because we have a high number of people who receive said benefits. And so as a result of that, we are in a space and place where this is when we need our champion the most. And so to be left to have taxation without representation, as they say, and not have our champion and our leader at a time such as this is an unconscionable activity that's taking place as we speak.
Has he given an explanation as to why he's left this seat, the special election, why he's left it so long?
There's more politics and political banter. He, I think, tried to start pointing fingers at our county in terms of a reason or basis. But the truth of the matter is, it's an illustration of just placing politics over people rather than people over the politics. And our people deserve better than that. Whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, you deserve to have representation. And that is something I think that should not be taken lightly, should not be toyed with. And so it should have been done quickly so that this district can be represented. If you counted all the time from when Congresswoman wasn't able to vote, passed away, of course, and the time that Turner, after he's passed, and now this delay in having a special election, almost a year and a half over a 2 year span.
So I know that the special election has actually been scheduled. So when is that? And tell me what people should expect in relation to that.
I find myself being in the position where I am finding a lot of people were unaware that they were fully aware that the special election had not yet been called, but didn't get the memo when it actually did get called. Although delayed, it has been called, and it will be on November 4th, 2025. It will be one big giant general election, so there will be no primary contests beforehand. It will just be a general election in which all candidates, Republican, Democrat, Independent, will all be on one ballot. And if no one receives 50% plus one, then you'll move into a runoff in December. So that's kind of the trajectory we anticipate. We've got to get the word out to folks that that special election is in fact taking place. I go to churches and different events, and people are saying, I wish that they'd call this special election. I was like, oh no, it's been called. It's just going to be November 4th. And so we've got to get the word out. So I appreciate you asking that question.
That's left nearly 800,000 Houstonians without representation, right, for a long time. And that's never good, especially at the start of hurricane season, because I think we are at the start of hurricane season, right? And I believe that there have been cuts to FEMA, which may affect Texas specifically. How has that affected Houstonians in relation to this, in relation to FEMA, in relation to hurricane season? How has the seat being open and not being filled? How has that affected everyone there?
I was a city council member when 51 inches of rainfall fell across our city in a storm known as Harvey. That devastation at the time was the second worst disaster in American history in terms of dollars and cents, and created mass devastation. There are still people to this day who have not yet fully recovered from the aftermath of Harvey, whether it be housing needs or otherwise. There's still need in as it relates to really having a full recovery, particularly within the 18th Congressional District. And when I learned a number of them, particularly the senior citizens in some of our lower income areas, were not getting the help that they needed. A lot of them were cleaning up the house, but not removing walls from their homes that had been soiled by floodwater, which would result in mold. We mobilized hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, and we would go door to door and check on them and get them the help that they needed. And so, one of the things I must say, I have been on the ground, someone who knows where the policy gaps are, where the funding gaps are. And we at that time had just experienced 500-year flood events in a row. So when we say that the infrastructure investment needs of our community are great, they are tremendously great because of the fact that we have challenges with drainage, we have challenges with flood mitigation, we have challenges with the topography of our region. There are a variety of things that really require high dollar investments into our region, and of course our tropical climate with these storms that just create a perfect storm for us. And so to not have that advocate in that 18 congressional seat advocating right around hurricane season, it is horrific. We need that investment in our bayou system, which helps to drain the waters out. We need that investment in our drainage. We need that investment so that we can keep our residents safe. People should not be afraid. And this is what happens now. There's a great deal of fear when it starts to rain in Houston because they don't know if that means flash flooding. They don't know if that's going to result in some type of major catastrophe that they're not aware of. And so it's a lot of people have PTSD as a result of the flood events that we've encountered. And so to not take this time when we're not having a disaster to invest, I think is a disservice to the people that we serve. And so we have to keep the images of those that were floating on boats front and center because we need to be in the business of preventing these types of harms of our community members. And so sadly, a lot of politics, people get amnesia or easily forget, have short memory spans when it comes to catastrophes. And yes, it was horrible, but let's turn the page and move on. And moving on for us ought to mean making the appropriate investments. And so having that advocate that can say, this is how we need to invest in this region from an infrastructure standpoint, and also how we can retool both FEMA and how community development disaster recovery dollars work. A lot of that money, a lot of that funding, it does not flow down appropriately to the residents that it seeks to serve. By way of having to pass new rules, when you have a disaster, you're waiting several months before you really truly understand or appreciate what the policy will be, whether they're going to buy out your street or not when there's a disaster. So I do think there is a need for a overhaul of disaster recovery so that it works better for people and can reach more people as opposed to just simply having an emphasis on avoiding fraud and abuse, which is what I've witnessed. There's very quick to get to a no, not very quick to get to a yes. And sadly, you're talking about populations that really do need case management, need support in navigating really complicated systems like this. I'm a Harvard trained lawyer who happened to also be a city council member, and I can tell you it's complicated. It's not an easy road to navigate when you're having disasters. And so trying to keep us out of the realm of having those situations in the first place, the primary thing that we can do is to make those investments in terms of the infrastructure. I always tell people we can't stop it from raining, but we can be prepared to catch it. And that's where the government and infrastructure and all of the preventative measures come into play.
And people should understand storms like Harvey were not an anomaly, right? You had
No.
Hurricane Ike before that, I think in 2008. And with climate change, these are going to be happening more often, right? So, and of
Absolutely. And we've had several unnamed storms
right.
in, like I mentioned, 500-year flood events in 3 years, which means that we're not due for another 1,500, right? And
Yeah.
so, but
Yeah.
that's obviously not true. And so climate change, as you stated, makes this a real problem for our region. And we also need to make sure our policies reflect trying to look at this from a holistic lens as opposed to just a response after a disaster strikes. Why don't we try to do our best to prevent them from happening in the first place? And that's where the concerns about the environment come into play and climate change. I'm going to go back to a story of what happened after Harvey, and it was just something that sticks with me. So, when the 51 inches of rainfall happened, and I got a call to go check on some of our lower income seniors, I learned that a lot of them were cleaning out their houses, but they weren't removing the walls that had been soiled by the flow waters, which could result in mold setting in. And so we mobilized hundreds of volunteers. We went door to door. And we knocked on those doors. And one of the first things that they would say to me when I'd stand on their doorsteps was, "What are you doing here?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm your city council member. I'm here to help." And then they followed it up with this question that sticks with me to this day, which was, "But wait a minute, are you up for reelection already?" And it was heartbreaking how many times I would hear that question. And the reason, of course, is that they are so accustomed to seeing their leaders and those that are seeking office show up on their doorsteps when it's campaign season and show up when we need something from them, but never showing up when it's time to make that deposit, when it's time to make good on those promises, when it's time to deliver those results. And to me, that represents us being in a moment where a lot of people feel as though democracy isn't working well for them. And then they want to disengage as a result. They don't trust it. And we've got to be in the business of restoring that confidence that what is said on a campaign trail can actually get delivered, and that we don't just have amnesia. We know your name, we know how to find you, we know where you vote, how you vote, we know what coffee you drink when you vote, right? But we don't know anything about you when it's time to deliver. We get selective amnesia. We don't want to get the phone call from your house. We don't want to deal with the constituent response. And that's the wrong approach. And what happens when you have that lack of accountability, that lack of connection between politics and government, it erodes people's confidence. It erodes their trust and confidence in what can occur and what will occur. And so I want to be in the business of restoring confidence and be in the business of not over promising, but instead over delivering. I want to be in that business. And I think if we do more of that and elect more people who are in that business, we're going to find that there are going to be more people who will re-engage in this next election cycle. And so you've got to not just think about who the people are and what they say, but can they deliver? And I think that is a really important aspect of this work, and why when we talk about experience, that's why experience is referenced, right? It's not just because it's experience for experience sake. You're saying it because you're saying there's a connection between experience and then the ability to be effective. And that's what our residents need. That's what they need the most. They don't need any more speeches. They need people to deliver, and they need those transformative differences in their lives to become a reality.
Right. That's an incredible story. So they thought that you were there because you needed something from them. Like
Yes, it
it
was
never,
the second
yeah.
worst disaster in US history. Yet the first thing that came to mind was that I must need something from them. And they fully expected it. And this wasn't just, one house off here and a house over there. This was par for the course in various neighborhoods. They just didn't understand why I was there in their house and I wasn't asking them for a vote, because that's what they're used to, being exploited in that way. Is we know how to show up on your doorstep when it's campaign season. We know which doors to knock, and we will miss so and so and Mr. So and so will be so nice and all the things. But we don't do that when it's time to deal with their problems once we get on the other side in government. And so they were witnessing someone in government who wasn't campaigning, who was showing up for them and then actually doing something that helped in a more transformative way, not just in the superficial ways. I mean, certainly you can show up at an event, but how can you show up for people that in a way that transforms their life and makes a real difference? And so when we got into the business of helping people rebuild their homes and just really doing that difficult work, it was sadly very surprising for people to witness that. And I don't want to be an anomaly in that way. I want that to be the expectation. And part of that comes from setting that bar and standard of leadership and being the type of leader that people can point to that says, I trust her and she gets it done. I've had so many people come to me, I'm supporting you because you helped my grandmother with her house and you did this. And the actions, the work is what ought to help to make the case and tell the story. And right now, we don't have enough of that, making the case and telling the story with our action and our work and the accountability. And I think that's part of our equation that we've got to fix if we want to expect people to come back into the fold and push forward with new change and the shift in leadership that we need right now.
Right, right. That's really sad, actually, and it's an indictment. It's probably the
Yeah.
clearest indictment of how leadership generally. Not everyone does this, obviously. You're
Right.
not one of those leaders, but how they've shown up for people or not shown up for people, and that's
Right.
that's
And they're
that's really
used
sad.
to it. And that's why they disconnect.
Right.
Why they disconnect?
Yeah.
And you can't say to them, they use terms like voter apathy, but why? Why are
Right.
they apathetic? And not everybody has the same reason for staying at home as the next person. I'm not justifying staying at home, but you're in the business of serving people. You got to listen to them.
Right.
And you got to be present and understand, their issues and empathize. And there's a piece of this that we're missing right now, and that I think is required. And so we've got to do our work if we're going to expect some different results that we so desperately need from a leadership shift in this next cycle. We need it because
Right.
the agenda that's been set. The old adage, if you're not at the table, you're what's on the menu. We're not at the table right now. And so
Right.
we're on the menu, literally. And we don't want to do that anymore. So we've got to be in the business of setting the agenda. So part of that is we got to get the shift in who's in office so we can start to set the agenda. And you got to get the public to believe in you again. Something has gone wrong. And for different people, it's probably different things. And so we've got to have those hard conversations. We got to be honest. We got to be present. And we've got to actually keep that up on the other side. So once you win, can't forget that person's name or their address. You got to remember it. And not just for your own election, re-elect,
Right.
it's remember it so you can do a good job and keep these folks, in the spaces and places that you told them you were going to take them, and the vision that you helped them craft, help them realize that by the work that you do.
Right, exactly. And I think there has to be a connection with the voter when you do set the agenda and you go off to DC. That agenda has a material effect on their actual lives because when people are in the middle of hurricane season, they are thinking about their lives. They're not apathetic. They're thinking about the fact that my living room is flooded. And I think somebody said to me, I think this was Latasha Brown from Black Voters Matter. She was asking voters about feeling apathetic. And she says people aren't apathetic about their lives. And
Right.
if leaders can make the connection that the agenda and that the legislation that they are enacting has a material benefit to the people and their lives, then you can't really lose.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
well said. Well said.
Yeah.
And very true.
This isn't the only catastrophe, right? I mean, in terms of policy, your reproductive policy right now in Texas is kind of, a catastrophe in relation to the women who can't get reproductive care. I think since 2021, abortion has been effectively banned right there in Texas. So how are women there faring with that?
Texas is the most dangerous state in the nation to be pregnant. Why do I say that? Well, should something happen during your pregnancy, Texas believes that it is the state's business to become your doctor versus your actual physician's business to do that. And you've got to make sure that you create conditions that allow physicians and allow patients to have the appropriate patient doctor relationship. And the state doesn't have any business governing that relationship. That being said, you have increases in the rates of sepsis as a result of doctors withholding certain care, abortion care, because they're afraid that they could be prosecuted. You have certain instances in which women have died as a result of these delays across the state of Texas. There are even measures that they're seeking to have passed that would also prevent cities and counties from funding entities that help women cross state lines who are in need of abortion care. We have bounty like laws here. So the heartbeat bill, the worst and most stringent with no exceptions for incest, rape, was passed here first. We passed it in Texas. And then, of course, other states followed. Roe v. Wade occurred. And so the attack on women's health is unacceptable, and it is costing women their lives. They should have the right to choose what is the right choice for their bodies, right choice for their families, right choice for their health care. And that is not the state of Texas's business to do so. And yet and still, we have now a series of laws that reinforce these really horrible situations to occur in which women's lives are risked on a regular basis. And there's no course of action right now underway that really cuts back on that. So we are in a real crisis moment for women's health in Texas, and we've got to get leaders in who will fight to make sure that this stays front and center and that we have creative legislative solutions. For example, on the federal level, maybe criminalizing the bounty hunting that's happening in states like Texas. Those are ways in which we could look to find ways to make a difference in a state like Texas that is just really making it illegal to have women's reproductive health and freedom. And women should not be in a worse state today than they were 50 years ago. But sadly, in Texas, they are.
So tell me more about the bounty hunting. What's happening there? I mean, have people actually been followed or tell me more
Yeah, I
details
mean, I
about that.
don't have specific
Yeah.
examples of individuals to share, but yes, I mean, this is something that takes place where the law allows people to have incentives to follow and make sure that you're not participating in and aiding someone's abortion process or yourself, and also turning those individuals in and trying to reward that behavior. And so when you think about just how perverse those incentives are to really spend the time, if someone is in a position where they are in need of abortion care, that is the decision that they need to be able to make, whether they cross state lines or not, following someone to prevent them from doing so, and so forth. I mean, it is outrageous. It's offensive and it's dangerous. And that is the practice that we are allowing in the state of Texas. And so that's why I mentioned having some federal intervention there as a means. We've got to think creatively, right? It's not going to happen at the state level. The state legislature obviously embraces this attack on women's reproductive freedom and health. And so, what are the other avenues that one can pursue that can help protect women's health and keep them safe and not in fear of the ramifications of them doing what's best for their health and their bodies and families?
One of the things that really bothers me about this current time in the news cycle is that it's so chaotic that
Yes.
it isn't, this should be front of the news cycle. This should be front page news that women are dying. The sepsis rates, I think, have skyrocketed in Texas specifically because of this ban, right? And we aren't talking about this every day. This should be front page news, but we're talking about tariffs. We're talking about military parades. We're talking about everything but the fact that women's lives are at stake because of laws that have passed like that, the one in Texas.
Yeah, and it's all by design. The goal of this president has been, since he took office for the second time, was to create chaos, create so much chaos that from a defensive posture, you don't know where to turn. And so when there's this here and that there and this up here and that down there, you don't know where to go. And so what ends up happening is people start to feel overwhelmed. And so then with the feelings of being overwhelmed, that's when you start to witness people disengage. That's when they say things like, well, I used to watch the news, but I can't do that anymore. I'm turning on sports tonight instead. Let me do something to distract me from the chaos so that I can feel better. And so that's, I think we've been in the space of disengagement. And I think part of that is also by, like you said, it's by design, because now all of these other things that we ought to be talking about, we're not. We're so distracted, so disengaged now because of all of the chaos that we're not in position to fight back. And I think we've got to, in my view, and part of my run for Congress is to really bring some clarity and focus and vision around what does 2025's fight look like. And the same things that you were fighting for in 2024 when you were trying to support Kamala Harris are the same things that are up for grabs right now and are being attacked right now. And so we need people to re-engage, and they might need a reset after all that has taken place at the presidential election, but we need them to come back into the fold, re-engage. But we also as leaders need to provide people with a clearer picture on what that looks like. So for instance, you hear a lot about DEI and boycotting some of the companies that have now embraced anti-DEI policies or have reneged on some of their previous DEI approaches. Well, instead of just saying there ought to be a boycott, say that and then say what there ought to be. And so there could be investment in groups that are waging the litigation against some of these executive orders that are overreaching. For example, like the ACLU, you could be saying, take that money, put it here. And these are things that if I'm someone who is on the outside looking in, not in government, but I want to feel as though I am contributing to the fight in this moment, is a very concrete example of something you can do. And we ought to be using our platforms as leaders to provide that type of direction and clarity. I often talk about the civil rights movement, and it's been bad before. We feel bad in our lifetime, but our elders have had it pretty rough. But we're resilient as a community, and that's the beauty of all of this. We're resilient. We have grit. We know how to navigate challenging circumstances. So the question is, what is the strategy? How do we navigate out of this moment? Is the question that we've got to be looking towards the people who can lead us and to exude. And so we're in a moment right now where we're looking for our leaders to say, hey, here's our litigation strategy over here. Maybe what we're doing with the legislation is not as much as we would like because of the fact that we're not in power. But in the meantime, focus on this litigation over there. Or here's how you can be an advocate with protests or other means of participating in the democratic and civic engagement process. But I think it's time. It's June of 2025. We can't be on our heels at this moment in time. There's too much at stake. I just mentioned to you the cuts that came out of the House Republican passed budget of $900 billion to Medicaid and $300 billion to SNAP. So all of those social safety nets are under attack. We've got to get up and have a real strategy that engages our full public. And I think that's part of what leadership is about.
You're right. Rest if you need to, but we have to stay engaged. And you make a really good point about the 2024 election cycle. I think that people tend to forget that just because we aren't in a major election cycle, we aren't in a general election cycle, the problems are still there. We don't have people giving speeches on the Democratic side about what we need to do nationally or what we need to do in Texas, but the problems are still there. In fact, they're getting worse, right?
That's correct.
So we need to stay engaged. And if we aren't going to hear it in the mainstream media cycle, we need to talk about it.
Absolutely. But we have to, be aware. I've talked to so many people who are unaware of the fact that they're disengaged. They know that they're not paying attention to it, but they don't realize that it's part of a broader scheme and that now they fit into what's supposed to be happening right now. When you put it that way and you say, oh, you mean the chaos was intended to make me sit out on the side like this, and now I'm going along with that? I don't want to go along with that plan because obviously it's coming from the other side. And so when they open their eyes to the fact that they're now part of the design of this plan for our community, it's something that I think is important for us to discuss. It doesn't mean that you can't value or allow people to have their moment to reset. I welcome that. Mental health is important, and we need to make sure mental wellness and mental health are priority. However, once you do have that moment to reset, come back and re-engage. And that's the ask, is come back because we need you. We need everybody in this fight, but we have to also provide direction and leadership on what that looks like. What is this fight? And we've got to provide some clarity there. And that's the work of leaders.
So speaking of the abortion debate, I know that on the national stage, in the national discourse, people assume that since Texas is a red state, they aren't necessarily pro reproductive justice or people aren't pro democracy. But I know that's not necessarily true. People in Texas, women in Texas need reproductive justice. So what do people, when they're talking about Texas on the national stage, what do they get wrong about your state and about your district?
I think it's very tempting from the outside looking in to see a giant red state and characterize it as a monolith, right? And homogenous. And the truth of the matter is, I live in Houston, which is the most diverse city in the nation, in the United States. Most people would not guess that would be the case in a big giant red state like Texas, but we've got these cities that have quite a bit of diversity, quite a bit of political diversity, including most of the cities here are Democratic in terms of larger cities. And so you've got a lot more viewpoints than what is represented when you just look at a map of colors of red and blue on a map. Certainly, the voting bloc that participates at the highest levels at this time are Republican. But, what we consider Texas to really be is a non voting state. We have an edge democratically if we were to vote. The problem is getting our public to go and actually vote. And so when you have policies that are put into place that make it more challenging to vote, when you have an atmosphere that is tried to be intimidating, those are also mechanisms that are used so that we can remain a non-voting state. When it becomes a voting state, then that state map will flip blue. But until then, you're going to see that red front and center. Now, that means we need people advocating for what we need in the state. It doesn't mean everyone in Texas, because it's red, believes that we should deny women reproductive health. It doesn't mean that everyone in the state doesn't believe in climate change. There's quite a bit of diversity and viewpoint. It just doesn't reflect when you see the big map of red and blue states.
Right. And I want to keep reminding people that when you see a state like Texas and you see the voter turnout numbers, or you see that a state's gone red, but it's very diverse, you should remember that when we say non-voter, there's lots of gerrymandering happening in states
Oh,
like
yeah.
that. There's lots of voter suppression happening, right? So it isn't intended to be easy to vote in certain states. And so we should keep that in mind when we think about voter turnout. So I would imagine that Texas would look a lot different if those two factors weren't in play, gerrymandering and voter suppression.
Absolutely. No matter what community you're talking about, there's representation of that community here. We love that it's an environment where everybody's used to everybody. It doesn't mean there's no racism ever. And it's just a different kind of welcoming environment. And so when some of this rhetoric comes into cities like Houston, it's just fundamentally counter to our way of existing. We are an international city as well. 142 languages are spoken here. So this notion of all us versus them and that kind of rhetoric really doesn't have real strong foundation in a city like Houston. Now, of course, Houston is Houston, right? There are other places that don't have that same quality to it. And so certainly I recognize that Houston is a unique space, but that's where I'm from. That's the district I seek to represent. So this notion of the divisive nature of today in terms of just trying to turn us against each other, I think is so counterproductive, and from all kinds of lens, not just economic lens, but it's just counterproductive in terms of allowing us to be our best selves and have a community where everybody can thrive. That's my goal for the 18th Congressional District, is not just to have a community where we maintain a status quo or we just get by, but I really want everybody to have the tools and the ability to live their best lives and thrive. And so what does that look like from an education lens? What does that look like from a healthcare lens? What does that look like from an economic opportunity lens? And creating a system of policies that actually help further your ability to do those things as opposed to undermine them instead. And that's unfortunately in the state in which we are living right now, is a lot of reversals and relitigating things that have been established that help support people in terms of their rights or access to opportunity. And we really are going in the wrong direction. And so we've got to really make it our business to reverse course again.
Yeah. Did you say 142 languages?
142 languages. Don't ask me to speak more than two.
Okay, like when you said that, I was like, what could there possibly be? What two do you speak aside from
I
English?
can speak, of course, I speak English, but then a little bit of Spanish. But
Okay.
don't ask me to say anything.
Okay, okay. So what do people in this district, in the Texas District 18, what do they need from someone who's going to fill this seat?
Yes, I think there are several things. I focus on things that are what I call meat and potatoes issues: healthcare access, economic opportunity, and also education. When it relates to healthcare access, that came up for me as a young child. My father was sick, got diagnosed when I was about 10 years old with something called multiple myeloma, which is a very aggressive form of cancer that took his life when I was a teenager. But when he was going through that journey, I learned quite a bit about what our US healthcare system was or wasn't by way of me asking my father questions. I'd ask him things like, well, what happens if this insurance company, what if they say no to his life-saving treatments? And my dad would just respond to me and say, well, if they do, we just have to figure something else out. And I knew at an early age that wasn't the right answer. I was young, I was a young teenager, but I was like, that's the answer? And surely we have to have better systems than this. But we don't. And the point that I'm making here is that it's given me a sense of strong urgency to always know and to put at the forefront that there are real people's lives that are hanging in the balance of the decisions that we make or choose not to make, the systems that we create or choose not to fix. Those are things that really ought to be your motivators when you go into a place like Congress and there are all of these competing political interests. You got to think about the people's lives that need your help, and they can't afford for you to decide 6, 7, 8, 9 years later, whether they should have access to health care. They're really needing those decisions to be in place and to be the right ones to begin with. And that's why I carry a sense of urgency with me on issues such as healthcare. Separate from that, economic opportunity. We talked about Houston being the most diverse city in the nation. One day I asked the question, what good is it to be the most diverse if we're not solving the challenges that our diverse communities face? And in fact, when we look at small businesses in Houston in particular, we have a litany of small business interests and groups, but when it comes to accessing capital, scaling your business, and really having true opportunity to share in wealth and growth, those disparities exist here in a pretty prominent way. And so how do we go about, especially in this anti-DEI environment, making sure that our small businesses and small employers are still able to support themselves and support their communities and families? Because that's what small businesses are. They're the backbone of our economy. And so I'm very passionate about economic opportunity. And finally, education. I mean, I went from public high school to Eisenhower High School and the Aldine Public School District to Harvard Law School. And so I understand firsthand how important it is to have access to education opportunities. It is the great gateway to having the ability to thrive in your life. And so when we start cutting those down because we want to play politics with the dismantling of the Department of Education, peeling back on Pell grants and things like and funding for public schools, this is dangerous because we're putting our kids and most importantly, our future, because they're going to be the workforce that support us in the future, right? And we're putting them at grave peril. And I think we've got to really reverse course in, allowing education to become some political chip in some broader political game. It should never be some type of political chip to educate your children. That's unfortunately where we are, in both on a state level in Texas, with having now passed the vouchers program, which now will underfund public schools even more, to, of course, what's happening at the federal level with the dismantling of the Department of Education. So those are some of the issues. I would also say infrastructure investment, disaster recovery are also very big ticket issues for our community in the 18th Congressional District. And so having had the experience that I've had on the ground through policy advocacy, through funding advocacy, I'm trusted in this community to get those types of issues right. And I'm committed to it. There's been too many seniors whose homes I've gone in where there's mold and they had easy yeses they should have received from FEMA or from the disaster recovery programs that could have helped rebuild their homes. And instead, they were left to their own devices and told no, simply because we have systems in place that don't work. That's, in my mind, I believe a community ought to be judged by the way we treat our most vulnerable residents. And we have no business treating people who have had that type of devastation in that way, particularly those that have paid taxes and expect to simply be able to take advantage of programs that might exist to help them. They're supposed to help them. And instead, we've designed them in ways that don't. And so I'm deeply passionate also about doing right by community members who have been overlooked and told no in the past, and find ways that we can work our way to a yes so people can recover, so people can get back on their feet, so that people can really be in environments that are safe, healthy, and where they can thrive. So I would say those are the things that, are on the minds of the 18th Congressional District. That big, beautiful bill is on the minds of a lot of the 18th congressional members, especially when they find out that it was only passed by a margin of one vote. Had that 18th Congressional District seat been filled, we could have blocked it. And so that's heartbreaking for someone who might be stripped of their benefits as a result of the passage of what Donald Trump is calling this big, beautiful bill.
Well, Amanda Edwards, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I wish you well, and just thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it today. Thank you.